There is a number in your head right now. Probably 62. Maybe 65. And if you are being honest, you have never really questioned it. You just absorbed it somewhere, the way you absorb most things from a coworker, a calculator, a vague sense of what people do. But according to research from the Social Security Administration, only 13% of people name any retirement age other than 62 or 65. Those two numbers are not targets most people chose. They are defaults most people inherited. And the question this video is going to answer is a harder one. What if the number in your head is costing you the best years of your life? Ask someone why they plan to retire at 62, and the answer is almost always the same. That is when Social Security kicks in. That is when people retire. That is just how it works. And on a practical level, that is correct. The Social Security Administration does allow you to begin claiming at 62. That is a real eligibility threshold. But somewhere along the way, eligibility got confused with strategy. The earliest possible date became the default target. The floor became the plan. 62 as a retirement age was never designed by anyone looking at your life specifically. It came from policy, not from a careful analysis of when you would actually be happiest, healthiest, or most able to use your freedom. Congress set a floor. You turned that floor into a goal. The Gallup research on this has tracked the gap for decades. Workers consistently report expecting to retire around 66. The actual median retirement age, reported by retirees themselves, hovers around 62. Workers overestimate how long they will keep working. Retirees consistently look back and find they left earlier than they planned. And the most common reason people give for why they plan to work until 65 or 67? They never seriously questioned whether they should. This is what behavioral economists call a reference point. When 62 becomes the number in your cultural environment, it stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like a fact. And once something feels like a fact, you stop running the math on whether it is actually right for you. Before we get into whether 55 is the better number, we have to acknowledge the objection that is already forming in your head. Because most people hear retire at 55 and think one thing: I cannot afford that. And that is a real concern, one worth taking seriously. The financial case for retiring at 55 is not simple. It requires a different kind of planning than retiring at 62. But the question this video is really asking is not whether 55 is easy. It is whether the cost of waiting until 62 is one you have actually calculated. Because there is a cost, it is just not denominated in dollars. The numbers on a retirement calculator are relatively easy to grasp. You need X saved. You will withdraw Y per year. At a certain rate of return, your money lasts until you are 90 or 95. Most people have run some version of this math. What the calculator does not show you is a different kind of math. The years between 55 and 62 are not just years on a timeline. They are a specific kind of year that you will not get back. A 2016 study from Duke University School of Medicine tracked 775 adults across age groups from 30 to 90. The researchers were looking for when physical decline actually begins, not when people notice it, but when the data shows it. The answer was the 50s, not the 70s, not even the 60s. Men and women in their 50s showed measurable declines in balance, leg strength, and the ability to rise from a chair without using their hands. By the time people reach their 60s and 70s, aerobic endurance and walking speed are declining as well. The lead researcher summarized it directly. By waiting to test for these problems until people are in their 70s and 80s, doctors miss 40 years of opportunities to address them. That is a study about physical ability. But the same logic applies to retirement planning. By the time you finish accumulating the retirement you planned at 62, some of the things you planned to do with it will be harder than they are today. People who retire earlier report spending that time traveling, staying physically active, and staying genuinely engaged with the world. People who retire later report spending more of that time managing health. More doctor appointments, more recovery, more days where the body says no. That is not universal. There are healthy 65-year-olds and unwell 55-year-olds. But as an average, as a statistical pattern, the energy and freedom you are planning to enjoy at 62 is not the same as the energy and freedom that exists at 55. And this is where the trade-off gets real. The question is not just whether you can afford to retire at 55. The question is whether you have actually priced in what you are buying when you choose to wait. You are buying more money. But money is not what you retire for. You retire to use your time in ways that matter to you. And time is the one asset in your plan that does not compound. Put that plainly. 7 years, ages 55 to 62, at a reasonable level of health and energy and freedom. That is what is on the other side of choosing to wait. This is the part nobody talks about, and it matters more than almost anything else in your retirement plan. According to the Employee Benefit Research Institute's 2025 Retirement Confidence Survey, the median age workers expect to retire is 65. The median age retirees actually retired? 62. That 3-year gap has persisted across every wave of the survey for more than 3 decades. 3 years does not sound like much, but inside that gap is an uncomfortable truth. A very large portion of retirement plans are built around a timeline the person building them will not actually be able to follow. The EBRI data breaks down why people ended up leaving earlier than they expected. For about 40% of retirees in the 2025 survey, retirement came before they planned. 31% of those cite a health problem or disability as a driver. Another 31% name changes at their company, layoffs, restructuring, buyouts. Add that up. A meaningful share of people who plan to work until 65 or 67 will instead stop working at 62 because something happened. Their health, their employer, their industry. Something outside their control made the decision for them. And here is the problem with being forced into early retirement rather than choosing it. You arrive without the plan. You arrive without the bridge savings you would have built if you had known. You arrive at 62 claiming Social Security early, accepting a benefit that is roughly 30% lower than what you would have received at 67 because you needed the income and you had not prepared for any other scenario. Working until 65 is a plan, but it is a plan with a single point of failure. If your health changes, if your employer changes, if your industry changes, the entire plan unravels at the worst possible moment with the least possible runway. What planning for 55 forces you to do is build a fundamentally different structure. You cannot rely on another decade of income to bail you out. You have to actually get there. The accounts have to be there. The bridge has to be there. And paradoxically, that level of planning provides something the 62 plan almost never does. Genuine optionality. If you are financially ready to retire at 55 and choose to keep working, that is entirely your call. But if you are not ready and something forces your hand at 58 or 60, you are negotiating from a position of weakness rather than one of choice. The question is not just whether you can retire at 55. The question is whether your plan is strong enough to survive the thing that eventually happens to almost everyone, the part where life does not go the way you planned. There is a version of the wait longer math that sounds compelling on paper. Work 7 more years, contribute more to the accounts, let compound growth continue, delay Social Security claiming until full retirement age for a higher monthly benefit. Walk away at 62 or 65 with a larger number than you would have had at 55. That is all mathematically real. More time in the workforce generally produces more savings, and more savings generally produces more options in retirement. Nobody is arguing otherwise. But that math has a denominator nobody puts on the calculator. What does a year between 55 and 62 actually cost you? Not financially. The other way, think about what people actually want to do in retirement. Travel that is physical, that requires walking, climbing, carrying bags, adjusting to new environments. Time with people who are still here to spend it with. Activities that require sustained energy. Starting something new, whether that is a business, a creative practice, or a volunteer commitment that demands full engagement. All of those things are easier at 55 than at 65. Not impossible at 65. Easier at 55. The Duke research says it plainly. By the time you are in your 60s, aerobic endurance is measurably declining. Gait speed is declining. The body is working harder to do things that felt automatic a decade earlier. That is the body your retirement plan is waiting for. The 62 plan assumes that the version of you who finally arrives at retirement will be able to use it the same way the 55-year-old version would. But that is not how biology works. You do not pause the clock while you accumulate the money. Now, layer in something harder to quantify. One of the most under-discussed costs of staying in work past the point where you could leave is what it does to your sense of agency. Every year you work past the point where you genuinely had the option to leave is a year of reinforcing a story about yourself, that you are not quite free yet, that you are still answerable to a schedule someone else designed. That freedom is still a future state, not a present one. The people who retire early are not just talking about the money when they describe what changed. They are describing what it feels like to make a genuine choice rather than follow a default. And that shift, from managed by circumstances to directing your own time, has costs when it arrives late, and benefits when it arrives early that no calculator captures. The research on this is consistent. People who describe themselves as having chosen when to retire report much higher satisfaction with retirement than people who describe being pushed out. The act of choosing matters independently of the financial outcome. Two people with identical account balances can have radically different retirement experiences based on whether they arrived on their own terms or on someone else's. And the person who built toward 55 and chose to stay working until 58 still made a choice. The person who planned for 65 and got pushed out at 60 did not. There is also a dimension here that rarely gets discussed in financial planning conversations: the cost of deferred living. Every year you spend working past the point where you could have stopped is a year of telling yourself that the real version of your life begins later, that the things you actually want are still in the future. That version of the story has a compounding cost of its own, one that does not show up in any account balance but does show up in how people describe the years they spent waiting. If this is making you rethink the number you have been carrying around, there is more of this every week. Like and subscribe, and we will keep building. Retiring at 55 is not a fantasy available only to people who earn seven figures. It is a specific financial architecture that requires specific decisions made earlier than most people are currently making them. The math is more demanding than the 62 plan. But the math is solvable, and the people who solve it are rarely the highest earners in the room. They are the people who built the right structure early enough. The bridge. Between 55 and 59 and a half, you cannot access traditional retirement accounts without penalty. That means your plan at 55 needs a non-retirement taxable account, or a Roth conversion ladder built years in advance, or another bridge vehicle that covers that window without triggering early withdrawal penalties. This is not a footnote in the plan. It is the first structural requirement. If the bridge is not built, the plan does not work regardless of what the 401k balance says. Healthcare is the second requirement that catches people. You are not eligible for Medicare until 65. 10 years of private health insurance coverage is a real cost that needs to be modeled into the projection, not left as a line item to figure out later. For many households, this single variable is the difference between the math working and the math not working. But it is a solvable problem with a known cost structure, not an unknowable risk. The Social Security decision is more flexible than most people assume. Retiring at 55 does not mean claiming Social Security at 55. The earliest you can claim is 62. And for most people, the financially optimal choice is to delay claiming well past 62 even if they are no longer working. If you retire at 55, build a bridge that funds the gap and let Social Security continue growing until 67 or even 70, the monthly benefit you eventually receive is substantially larger than if you claimed the moment your paycheck stopped. That sequencing requires deliberate planning, but the outcome is often more favorable than people expect. The spending model matters more than people realize. Research consistently shows that retirees spend more in the early active years, less in the middle years as lifestyle naturally simplifies, and more again in the final years as healthcare becomes the dominant line item. A retirement plan that models flat spending from 55 to 90 will be wrong in ways that compound over time. The plan needs to reflect the actual shape of how you will spend across 3 phases, not a single assumed withdrawal rate applied across decades. None of this is simple, but all of it is plannable. And the person who begins building this architecture at 45 has a fundamentally different set of options than the person who first considers it at 60. The 55 retirement is not built by working harder at the end. It is built by designing the arc of the whole plan differently from the beginning. The 62 plan requires relatively modest intentionality across a longer runway. The 55 plan requires higher intentionality applied earlier. The person who chooses 55 does not outwork the person who chooses 62. They make different decisions with the same dollars, starting sooner, with a clearer picture of what they are actually building toward. Remember the number from the top, 62, the one you absorbed without quite deciding to absorb it. Here is the calculation that almost never gets run. Take the years between 55 and 62, 7 of them. Now set the money aside entirely. Think about what you would actually do with that time. If you had 7 years of genuine freedom starting at 55, with reasonable health and full energy, what would you do with that time? Not what you think you should do. What you would actually do. For most people, the answer involves things that require a body that works well, travel that is real travel, not managed tourism, physical pursuits, time with people who are still here to spend it with, starting something new while there is still runway to see it through. Now ask the harder question. Do you believe with certainty that you will be able to do those same things at 65 with the same ease, the same energy, the same options? Or does part of you know that 7 years will make some of those things more difficult? The Duke University data does not leave much room for optimism on the mechanics. Aerobic endurance is declining through the 60s. Gait speed is declining. Balance is declining. The body at 65 is working harder than the body at 55 to accomplish the same things. That is not a verdict on your future. It is a description of a biological pattern that applies across populations. And the EBRI data closes the loop on the planning side. Around 40% of retirees in the 2025 survey did not choose when they left the workforce. Something decided for them. Health, an employer, an industry that changed. They arrived at retirement with whatever plan happened to exist at that moment, not the plan they had intended to build. The people who planned for 62 and were forced out at 58 did not get those extra years of saving they were counting on. They got an early exit without the architecture for an early exit. The people who planned for 55 and were pushed out at 58 were 3 years ahead of schedule, with a structure already built for the early finish. You are not giving away your best years on purpose. You absorbed a default and you have been building toward it because everyone around you is building toward the same thing. But you might be giving them away without realizing it by treating 62 as a destination rather than examining whether it is actually the right one for you. This is a life decision. It is not a financial optimization exercise dressed up with a retirement age. The money is the mechanism. The years are what you are actually deciding about. You are not broken for planning to retire at 62. You absorbed a default that virtually everyone around you also absorbed because the system was designed to make 62 feel like the natural endpoint, the earliest Social Security date, the conventional finish line. Nobody suggested you question it because questioning it requires doing something most retirement planning skips, actually pricing the years themselves, not just the money in them. When you run that calculation honestly, the framing changes. The question stops being whether you can afford to retire at 55. The question becomes whether you can afford not to plan for it. Not because 55 is right for everyone, but because the person who genuinely builds toward 55 ends up with something the 62 default almost never produces. A real choice made with real information about what they want their life to look like on the other side. That is a different thing than arriving at retirement because a threshold appeared and you hit it. If this raised more questions than it answered about how the actual mechanics work, the next video goes into the specific architecture, the bridge accounts, the Roth sequencing, the Social Security timing strategy that makes an early exit financially possible for people who are not already wealthy.